Section 19 of Centuries Apart. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tom Shoesmith. Centuries Apart by Edward T. Bouvé. Chapter 12. The Defense of Eagle's Crag. For Lady fair, see that thou fight. Marmion. About 1 o'clock in the morning, he was awakened by a knock at his door, and as he had not undressed, he sprang up and opened it. Vivienne stood there, her great mass of dark hair enveloping her lithe form, her eyes flashing in the light of the torch borne by a servant, her face deadly pale. "The fiery cross on Owl's head, Captain," she said. Percy seized and belted on his sabre, thrust his revolvers in his belt, took his rifle and slipped in a cartridge, shouted to his men in the adjoining apartment, who appeared fully armed, and then followed the maiden to the turret, from which he saw a strange sight. On the black face of the mountain across the lake was a veritable blazing cross. It must have been formed from piles of combustibles arranged down the steep side of a precipice for a considerable extent. It was burning brightly, and about its own length below it was another single fire. "That meaneth," remarked the maiden, "that the foe is marching rapidly through the pass." "How long before they'll reach the lake and cross the bar?" "'Tis near sunrise now, Sir Captain," replied the seneschal who had joined them. "They will, doubtless, halt in the hamlet opposite, to eat, ere they attack. They may be looked for in 2 hours' time. Let your men have a stout breakfast, and send those whom I want with me to the outwork within an hour, unless the enemy appear sooner. What range has this gun?" he continued, laying his hand on the little culverin near by. The seneschal hesitated. "Verily, I know not thy meaning, my lord," he replied, puzzled. "Will your cannon shoot to the bar, and have you men who can shoot it straight?" "That can I, my lord, and it will reach the bar," rejoined the man proudly. "Then, when they cross the narrow part, give them a round or two and hasten to join me. Dispose the rest of your men to make the best fight possible at the castle in case we all fall, and tell your men it is victory or certain massacre for all of us." "Ne'er fear, my lord. They will die ere the foe cross the drawbridge, if we cannot stop them with our lives at yon gorge," said the man. "Stop! There are no boats left on the other side of the lake?" "Only one, my lord, on which our sentinel is now coming from the Owl's Head. There he cometh, passing the Isles of the Three Spirits. The other boats are all drawn up in the wood at the Swan Maiden's Dell." "That's well. Now all is ready." Percy descended to the hall. The ladies, pale as ashes, but brave and cheery, were at the board. Vivienne watched Percy wistfully as he ate a substantial meal, and the men below the salt did like justice to the good cheer. The dreamy Percy was transfigured. I who write know whereof I speak, for was he not my friend, and more than that? Suddenly the gun boomed from the battlements. Percy sprang to his feet. "Down to the breastwork, men, double quick!" he shouted. "Alois, take my rifle. I'll be there shortly." He rushed up to the tower. The seneschal was there at the gun with 3 more men, hastily reloading. "Hurrah, my lord captain!" he shouted. "My first shot struck them in front." Percy saw the head of a column of cavalry in disorder on the narrow causeway or bar. 2 or 3 horses were down struggling, and 1 or 2 knights were trying to restore order and get the way cleared. "Shall I fire after the next shot, sir?" asked the seneschal. "Judge for yourself, seneschal," replied Percy. "Get in more if you can. Then rejoin me at the breastwork. Whom leave you in charge here?" "A good man, the archer Robin Oakleaf." "Good. I go now." And Percy rushed down, to hear, as he descended the narrow stairway, the culverin boom again, and another wild cheer from the gunners. "Ha! That's told too," he muttered. Hastening through the hall, he met the ladies. Lady Dacre knelt and called the blessing and protection of the saints on him. Vivienne held out both her hands. He caught and kissed them, and was gone. He ran swiftly to the breastwork. the drawbridge rising after him as he passed over, and the portcullis rattling down. All warders and men-at-arms seemed to be at their posts. At the barrier he found his own men and 20 archers and arquebusiers, who also bore long spears. They huzzaed lustily as he appeared. "Now, my Yankees," said he cheerily, "pick out the knights, those with the plumes, and aim low." He took his rifle and cocked it. The thunder of hoofs resounded, coming at a gallop up the pass. In a moment they appeared round the bend, a dark mass of men-at-arms, headed by 2 or 3 knights with waving plumes. "Commence firing, and keep cool," shouted Percy, taking aim himself. There was a crashing volley of rifles and arquebuses, and a flight of arrows whistled away. Then the Americans, whose arms were repeaters, aimed and fired again. It took some time to load the clumsy arquebuses, but the Yankees fired so fast that it sounded like the skirmish fire of a large party. In a few seconds the smoke cleared, and there was the column, still staggering forward, struggling over fallen men and horses, and in great confusion. Every American shot appeared to tell, for in a moment there was a halt, then a rapid and irregular retrograde movement, and the enemy disappeared round the curve, leaving a dozen of men and horses struggling, or quite still where they fell. "Hurrah, my brave fellows! You've done well," cried Percy. "But load away! They'll be back in a minute." Soon the enemy reappeared, this time on foot, running up the rise, a knight in front, waving his sword, and bearing his pennon himself in his left hand. "Aha, I thought so," muttered the captain. "Now 'twill be hand to hand," and he drew a bead carefully on the knight. A few files back, however, rode a knight with extraordinarily heavy plumes. The knight in front sprang into the air with a shriek as Percy's rifle crashed, and this mounted one spurred to the front. "Ha!" cried the seneschal who had joined the defenders. "That is my Lord of Pembroke himself. Stand to it stoutly, sons of Ben-Ardlac. Now cometh the hot of it." The American rifles kept up their steady, deadly fire, a man dropping at each crack, and the whir of the arrows continued, but the arquebusiers fired only once more, and then throwing aside their cumbrous pieces, seized their spears and lined the barrier. The enemy, still led by the knight of the heavy plumes, pushed fiercely on despite their severe losses, until they reached the chevaux de frise, only some 2 rods away. Here they were detained, cutting fiercely away at the obstruction with their battle-axes. Several of the assailants fell, but they gave no ground and finally forced a passage. Their archers had climbed upon rocks at the side of the pass, and were shooting at the defenders, some of whom dropped. Meanwhile Pembroke himself rushed stubbornly on, followed by his men-at-arms, who with loud shouts began to climb the breastwork. Percy, raising his piece, aimed point-blank at the Baron, and fired his last shot, but unfortunately it glanced off his helmet and struck the man next to him through the brain. Suddenly Pembroke's head and shoulders appeared above the parapet. He instantly rose yet higher, and made a furious downward thrust with his sword at Percy. The seneschal partly parried the weapon, but it cut through the captain's uniform, and the hilt struck his side, hurling him backward. The captain seized his opponent's wrist as he fell, and fired his pistol squarely in the man's face. His enemy, pitching forward heavily, struck on his head and lay motionless. There was fierce stabbing and hacking at the few men-at-arms who climbed the works, and in a moment the enemy recoiled, although still facing the Ben-Ardlacs in surly rage. Then ensued for a few seconds a cessation of the savage struggle, during which brief space there was heard loud shouting and clashing of arms further down the pass. Then came another surge forward of the attack, and suddenly Percy became aware of something waving over him in the air. Glancing back, he saw some 20 men, the defenders who had been left to man the castle, rushing to reinforce his line. At their head was Vivienne Dacre, her long hair streaming in the wind, the banner of the Ben-Ardlac clan in her hands, her eyes blazing like flame, her face gleaming with warlike beauty, a perfect Bellona. "Listen," she called to Percy in a tone like a silver trumpet. "My brother's pennon is on the narrow way. The clan Ben-Ardlac attack the foe in the rear. If we hold them back here, not a man of the scum escapeth us. "Show them no pity, clan of the Mountain Bear!" she cried, waving her banner. The arrows were meantime flying thickly. Percy felt one tear through his sleeve, slightly cutting the arm. Several clansmen were struck down. He seized the wild girl and drew her from her exposed position, and snatching the banner from her grasp, gave it into the hands of a mountaineer. Then he bore her, struggling to free herself, to an old man who lay against a rock with an arrow through his side. "Here," cried he, "hold your lady in the shelter, out of their shooting." The dying clansman, with a last desperate effort, seized the maiden, and held her out of the danger, despite her indignation. Percy sprang to the works again, and perceiving that the enemy were giving way, he could no longer restrain his cavalry instincts. Drawing his sabre, and with his revolver in the left hand, he leaped over the works, followed by the mountain warriors shouting their battle cry. The enemy fairly turned and fled, but the Benardlacs were upon them in a moment, cutting them down mercilessly. Then, in an instant, Captain Percy saw his mistake. The enemy, penned in the narrow way by an attack both in front and rear, finally turned in dogged despair, and being mostly in armor, they had the advantage in hand-to-hand combat. For a moment things looked very ominous for Percy and his men, but he and his Americans drew off a few steps and used their revolvers rapidly. These produced such execution that a fresh panic seized the assailants, who, throwing away their arms and falling on their knees, shrieked for mercy. They might as well have asked it of fiends. They were cut down and slaughtered as if they had been wolves, being indeed no better than such ravenous beasts, and were but receiving the fate to which they had devoted the clan Benardlac. While Percy was climbing the breastwork to lead his men to this attack, he had suddenly glanced backward at Vivienne Benardlac, and had witnessed an act which almost unnerved him. And now, the victory being won, the butchery going on under his eyes was so terribly revolting that he leaned for an instant against a rock, becoming sensible at the same time of a faintness, which he soon found had a physical cause. He felt a warm stream flowing down his side. In a moment more everything grew misty before his eyes, and he sank to the earth, while the fight, or rather massacre, swept down the pass. The end of section 19.
Section 20 of Centuries Apart. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Centuries Apart by Edward T. Bouvé. Chapter 13. She loved not wisely, but too well. A weary lot is thine, fair maid, a weary lot is thine, to pull the thorn thy brow to braid, and press the rue for wine. Rokeby. When Arthur Percy opened his eyes to consciousness, he found himself lying on a bed in a room of the castle. Several people were around him, and some were just finishing the dressing and bandaging of a wound in his side. He recognized the face of Aloise, then that of the Lady Dacre, and next he saw the handsome visage of the Chief Rouval, Benardlac, otherwise Lord Ducray, who bent over him and was holding and wringing his right hand. "Welcome back to thy senses, gallant guest and friend," cried the chieftain, looking vastly relieved. "'Tis to thee we owe our victory, and let me tell thee, thou hast not a bad wound, nor one which had much weakened thee, save that thy hurt at Ravenscliff had made thee unfit for such rare fighting. My halidome, for a man without armour to have overcome and slain the fell Pembroke in complete mail. And I tell thee, noble stranger, 'tis to thee I owe the lives of these my mother and sister, and my castle and clan. By Saint Anne of the Shrine, what can I say to thee?" "Thank heaven for the outcome," said Arthur in a low voice. "But had it not been for your coming upon their rear as you did, my lord, I fear that the brave handful of your clan had not withstood so fierce an attack. We were too few for them, "I think not," replied the chief. "They were already beginning to withdraw to their horses when we fortunately came up. Their leaders slain by you, they e'en had lost heart. They looked not for such resistance, the fell scum of murdering villains. But here I rave, and thou shouldst rest and sleep. To-morrow thou shalt have tidings. Meanwhile all thy friends be safe and sound, and are with our array in the fens. Sleep well now on that. Till the morrow, farewell." The Lady Dacre now gave Percy a sleeping draught, and all then withdrew from the chamber, save Aloise, who remained in attendance. Percy slept for many hours. When he awoke it was early the next day. Aloise still sat by his bedside. Percy looked up. "Aloise," said he, "how came I wounded? I knew nothing about it." "Ah, mon capitaine," replied the octoroon, "ze sword, de zat dog Pembroke, it cut ze capitain's uniform, and made to bleed ze side. Ze hurt is not deep. You will be soon, sar. If you lie still, ze's 2-3 day." Aloise bathed Percy's face and head, and made him more comfortable. There was a knock at the door, and upon its being opened, the Lady Dacre and her daughter entered. After kind inquiries about his health and rest, the lady ordered Aloise to get his breakfast, and a moment after she said that she would go herself and see to the preparation of a meal for Percy, which Aloise would be ready to bring by the time it was prepared. Vivian was thus left alone with Percy. Suddenly it rushed into the young man's recollection that he had not seen her since he led the sortie from the breastwork the day before. It seemed to him at least a week since the fight, and he remembered what he had witnessed at a glance at that time. The thought of it gave him a shudder, and he turned his face involuntarily to the wall. She started back, trembling, and walked to the window, where she stood looking out and holding on, as if for support, to the side of the casement. Now what Percy had seen was this. As he climbed upon the breastwork to spring over and lead the counter-attack, he glanced back. The Lord Pembroke, who had fallen apparently dead inside the works, had sat up and was trying to rise, sword in hand. But Vivian Dacre threw herself upon him like a tigress, and drove her long dagger again and again between the bars of his helmet. Percy did not wait to see more, but the fact was that in the sequel the wretch fell back dead. Finally the girl turned partly from the window and looked at him askance. "They tell me thou didst take no hand in the killing after the fight." "No," he replied. "And you ne'er slay in the pursuit in your land?" He was about to answer no, but thought of Winchester and some other battles, and was silent. At last he said, "I never did. But we do not kill prisoners, especially wounded ones." "But you shot that wretch down, and left him stunned, to come to himself again, to rise and stab you in the back. And because I was there, I whom he had devoted, together with my kin and clan, to slaughter, after having sworn basest insult to me that I would not wed him, because I was happy and now to be by and to save you and avenge myself and my own by a dagger stroke. You look darkly away from me, as I were a mountain she-wolf." She burst into a torrent of uncontrollable sobs and tears. Percy was terrified. "No, no, no," he cried. "I pray you do not think this. I did not understand. Indeed, I thought the man was mortally wounded, and it startled me to see you strike him. I pray you not think me ungrateful. Come here." She leaned against the wall, weeping bitterly, and looked only once at him with a face of intensely reproachful grief. Percy tore his hair. At last he started up on one elbow, in the effort displacing a bandage, and instantly a stream of blood flooded his left side. The maiden was on her knees by the low couch in an instant, the thick tresses thrown behind her shoulders, her face still wet with tears, yet sobbing, but working simply and deftly to adjust the bandage and stop the bleeding. It was no great matter to accomplish this, but as she was so eager about it, Arthur let her do what he could have easily done himself, and then took both her unresisting hands in his own, saying very gently, "You must not be so grieved because I had not seen nor understood fully about that thing yesterday. You mistake me wholly. Indeed, I could not look darkly at or away from you. I would I knew what to say to make you happy again." He stopped in spellbound surprise and admiration. The creature kneeling by him all at once seemed to change her nature. She raised her head to a strange height, and then gently and slowly, turning her neck with a lithe, swan-like movement, the burning brown eyes slowly approached his, until, while they seemed to look through his soul, his own, alas, saw clearly into her heart. Again the fragrant mist of fascination seemed to surround and exhale from her. He did not see her lips, so like scarlet rosebuds, move. They seemed to be slightly parted and only breathing these words, in scarcely audible yet siren-like sweetness of tone: "Thou canst say, that will make me happy again, and evermore." "And what may that be?" he asked, almost as inaudibly, and speaking only to gain time to collect his utterly panic-stricken thoughts, for in bitter regret and sorrow he had read her secret. "Even a swan maiden may not tell thee," she hardly whispered, and she dropped her burning face until it almost rested on his heart. And there, beneath his disarranged garments, she saw that which quite rested on his heart. Quickly she withdrew her hands from his grasp. Without seeming effort, she rose instantly to her full height and stood quivering above him, the picture of agonized amazement, with fingers strained in tremulous vehemence over her bosom, the face half averted of a deathly pallor, blue lips parted for quick, short, convulsive gasps, and eyes fairly blazing, fixed upon that which rested on his heart. Arthur Percy looked up at her, soul-sick with helpless, useless pity. Then she swooped above him again and seized the locket, tearing apart the chain which held it to his neck, and opened it, fairly devouring the picture within with feverish gaze. "Beautiful Kate Percy," she murmured to herself in a hollow tone, "as my dream," as the swan sang. She dropped the locket on his breast and turned away, standing a moment quite still, grasping her long black-brown hair with both hands, and gazing upward, a vivid statue of despair. Then she turned swiftly, and her long dagger flashed from her bosom and above it. For an instant she towered over him in wild, furious, beautiful madness. Percy had no time for fear, or even to formulate a thought, and yet he remembered afterward that, at the moment, it had shot through his brain that the coincidence would be a singular one, if the weapon which had ended the life of her ruffian lover Pembroke should cut the thread of his own. "Pardonnez-moi, mademoiselle," said Aloise softly, as his hand grasped firmly her little wrist. "It is not well to cut off the lock of hair to the Capitaine until he awaken himself up. He might start in his dreams and make to himself to be hurt. Venez, s'il vous plaît." He gently but sternly drew her toward the door. She looked at him in dazed wonder, but followed for a few steps unresistingly. Then her eyes rested on the dagger, and she stopped short and drew her hand over her forehead with a troubled expression. At length she came to herself, and gave the weapon into his hands, saying in a low, hurried voice, "You need fear not more, Heloise. It is all over." She turned and walked swiftly again to Percy, and stooping quickly, she took his face between her ice-cold hands and kissed him again and again, with lips which seemed to scorch. And while the man, miserable with bitterest remorse and sympathy, lay half-choking under her desperate caresses, she was no longer there. "Heloise," he said hoarsely, when they were alone, "never a word of this while you live." "Never, monsieur," replied the octoroon, in an awe-struck voice. "The poor young mamselle is mad." And fortunately, so Alois ever after believed. What a day the young man passed! Severely he upbraided himself, and yet as he thought over every hour of his sojourn at the Eagle's Crag, he could recall nothing which he had said or done which could have led to this. Full as heart and mind were of the image of Kate Percy, he had not dreamed that this weird, exquisite creature could love him. He had accepted hospitality here, and indeed unquestionably had been saved from destruction at the hands of the ruffianly Pembroke, whom he would doubtless have encountered in the mountain passes had he not been sheltered here, and so had dreadful sorrow come in his train to these kind friends. He was utterly wretched, and determined to set out as soon as he could stand and ride. End of chapter 13. Recording by John Brandon.
Section 21 of Centuries Apart. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. Centuries Apart by Edward T. Bouvé. Chapter 14. Parting. Now farewell, and if forever, then forever fare thee well. Byron. In the course of an hour the chieftain came in and told him the news. The mountain clans, it seemed, had become impatient at the inaction of the wary Angus, who would not move from his strong position in the fens until the arrival of the Duke with reinforcements. It was near their planting time, and they had expected a quick, sharp campaign, involving plenty of plunder with which to return to their mountain strongholds. At length Lord Sussex himself grew uneasy, fearing that his prey would escape him, and leaving his fortified camp, fiercely attacked Angus in the fens where the royal artillery was of no use. The result was his complete repulse with great loss, although this was not by any means a rout, and Sussex retreated in good order to his camp, still too strong to be followed by Angus. Meanwhile, news had come of the ravaging march of Pembroke through the mountains, whose defenders were absent with the insurgent army, and Angus dispatched Reuvel ben Ardlech with his clansmen to cut off and destroy Pembroke, which he had done with such success thanks to Percy's determined stand at Eagle's Crag. And, added the chieftain, your friends Warren and Pelham be at our camp, yet with Angus being refused safe passage by Sussex, who said he awaiteth clearer orders from his king. Meanwhile the king hath marched far to westward with his array, and ere long must needs fall in with the western lords, who have been joined by the Duke of Argramond. His Grace thought meet to march to their aid rather than to ours, saying that we could maintain ourselves in the fens for many days against Sussex, but that the west sorely needed his presence and leading. And a secret message from the Percy's friends in South London saith that the General Vaughan is enraged at the king's treachery, and hath marched with half his small army northward, to demand, sword in hand, that you and other officers and the troop of horse shall be restored to him safe and scatheless. Methinks he doth a hasty thing, for he may have to meet the whole array of Sussex. Yet Angus would then fall upon the Earl's rear, and a pretty battle would come of it, to our great joy. And I here helpless, groaned Percy, gnashing his teeth. Patient yet for a day or two, responded the chief, and I return with a part of the clan to the field, and with your good company, I ween. But Ben Ardlach received such tidings that night that he was obliged to march on the following day, and Percy was entirely unable to accompany him. He remained in this condition of forced inactivity for 3 days more, chafing terribly but still gaining rapidly his strength. At last an event occurred which favored his starting away on the second day after. This was the arrival at Eagle's Crag of a party of travelers. It consisted of the prior of the Abbey of Kentishward, a man of great ability and influence, much trusted by the king. He had been sent a month previously on an embassy to the great barons of the north to ascertain their condition of feeling and to try to break up their confederacy and prevent an outbreak. He was so much respected by the nobility of the realm, beside being of royal blood himself, and of near kin to the king, that it was at first likely that his mission would be successful. In fact, he had managed to detach the powerful Earl of North Devon from the disaffected party, but in the midst of his work he had been stricken down by a fever, and before he recovered the insurrection had broken out. He was now returning southward, and such was the respect and affection for his character that he travelled without question through the shires in revolt, lodging as a welcome guest at the very castles of the rebels and treated with the utmost consideration. He was to rest for a day at Eagle's Crag and then to proceed directly to the capital, passing necessarily near the positions of both the armies lying watching each other at the fens. It was Percy's opportunity to travel with comparative safety, and the prior expressed himself as pleased to have his company. The ensuing day was one of the most lovely which Percy had ever known. He had been up and about the castle and grounds for 2 days, constantly growing stronger, and this morning he sauntered out for a walk with no particular care as to its direction. He had not seen Miss Ben Ardlock since the painful interview of nearly a week before. Wrapped in thought, he had not noted much which way he went, when he all at once found himself on the wood road leading to the Swan Maiden's Dell, and as he approached the ravine which led to this locality, he determined to visit it once more. In descending the gentle slope, he observed the damage wrought by the tornado, and finally came out upon the charming spot. Being fatigued and heated by his walk, he stepped into the shrine and sat down on a rock near the doorway to rest. He had been there but a moment when, to his great surprise, he heard a female voice by the lakeside, warbling a plaintive air, and looking out he saw a form which he instantly recognized as that of Vivian. She was dressed entirely in black, and stood leaning against the same tree that she had rested upon the day of the tornado, distant but a few rods from him. She had evidently not observed his presence. Her attitude was most graceful. Her heavy hair fell loosely over her shoulders. Her face, which was turned partly away from him, was of a ghastly pallor. Her song was as sweet as that of a dying swan. There were some wild swans out on the lake, and they were, as before, slowly approaching her. In fact, she had been in the habit of petting and feeding them. Ever and anon she threw her voice out over the water, practicing that strange ventriloquism which had so startled him on the former occasion. And even now it was hard to realize that a response to her singing did not come from the birds themselves, as she sang some verses in this way. All at once she stopped, and putting her hands over her face, turned directly toward the young man. Fearful of disturbing her, and finding himself in an embarrassing position, he shrank back into the shrine. But she walked directly to it and looked in full upon him. "Pardon me, Miss Vivian," he said in confusion, "and believe me, I did not know." "Do not speak," she said. "Had you known of my presence here, you had not come, and I am most blithe of your coming. I would fain discourse with you for a brief space, for the last time in this world," she added in a choking voice. Then she went on very gently and sweetly, extending her hand. "I pray you walk with me to the tree where we stood together on that day." He took her hand, and they walked to the tree, and she leaned on it as she had done before. She seemed very weary, and he was shocked to see how haggard was her beautiful face, although there was yet a very peaceful calm in it. She looked at him, and spoke very frankly and very softly. "I feel no shame that I loved thee, and shall love only while life lasts, which will not be long. I only wonder that I had the wild hope that such as thou art might love the poor mountain maiden, the daughter of a prescribed name and clan, the more so that thou lovest and art beloved by the peerless Catherine Percy." She stopped a moment and looked out over the water, then went on. "Since the last day when I saw thee, I have been at Ravenscliff, and did abide a day with her. She is far more beautiful than when we were together at the convent. Thou couldst but have loved her, for she hath as much sweetness and tenderness as beauty. We mingled our tears, she both in pity for me, and for it might well be she ne'er should see thee more, I that I must ne'er again behold thee. It might have been different for me had fate ordered other than as things be. But nathless, I with all heart and soul wish her an early coming of her joy in thy return. I shall pray before the Virgin night and day for you both. For Yuletide past I take the veil at St. Helen's cloisters. At my desire they require not of me the novity, and the sooner I leave the world, the sooner cometh peace. Kate writ thee a letter, and I brought it thee. Take it. She handed him a quaintly folded and sealed missive, then continued, Now is this our eternal farewell, and I ask 3 things of thee, all very dear to my heart. First, take this poor gift, keep it till thy marriage day, then clasp it on the arm of thy bride. 'Twas once worn by the Lady Ida, the swan maiden of sorrowful memory. 'Tis a precious heirloom, and that I prize it so highly, I devote it as a little token of my love for thee and for her. May it prove an amulet. She unclasped the strange gold armlet with the swan's head and ruby eyes and gave it to him. Then she went on, Next I pray kind and tender remembrance and prayers whilst thou livest. Then this my last wish. She took both his hands in her own and looked, with a faint blush, full in his face, the brown, tourmaline eyes beaming with a lustrous softness that he had never seen in them before, yet expressing the very intensity of hopeless longing. I gave thee that last day in wild, heart-broken love 3 kisses. Give them now back to me with tender farewell, and this will be all betwixt us 2. Percy unfastened a gold crucifix which he wore, and clasped the chain about her neck. My mother had it always on her heart. She hung it over mine when she was dying. The girl's face expressed delighted surprise, and she kissed it fervently. It will ne'er again leave my bosom, she murmured. He took her in his arms, as if she had been a child. She laid her head wearily against his heart, gazing up at him. Her eyes, indeed, never left his. To the day of his death he was haunted by the wistful despair in her face. His own eyes were half blinded by tears. He kissed her as she had wished, saying, Farewell, Vivian. She drew herself back and turned slowly away, still looking upon him, as we look for the last time upon our dead. And like the sigh of the summer wind came the words, Farewell, Arthur. She walked away to the shrine and knelt before the image of the saint. Percy looked about him. The Swan Maiden's dell was beautiful in the morning light. Out on the isle-studded lake the sunbeams danced on the ripples with merriment, which seemed to mock his heavy heart. The far hills were brilliant in their fresh verdure, and the mountains beyond blue in the warm, misty atmosphere. Close inshore, within the quiet little cove, the white swans were watching him curiously, showing no fear, their reflection in the still water as perfect as themselves. He glanced up, and his eyes rested upon the cloisters of St. Helens in the dim distance, where Vivian would soon seek refuge and peace. Would she find the peace? God grant it, he thought, as he turned and walked slowly up the ravine. End of section 21.
Section 22 of Centuries Apart. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tom Shoesmith. Centuries Apart by Edward T. Bouvé. Section 22. Chapter 15. Grim-Visaged War, Part 1. What soldier's heart thrills not, who hears the rattle of the musketeers, the flashing scabbard's steely clank, the gun's deep boom on either flank, and 'neath the standard blue the cheers that fire the horseman's charging rank. Old Song. Percy made his farewell and acknowledgments to the Lady Dacre that night, and the next morning, very early, the little cavalcade left the Eagle's Crag. Just as it turned to enter the rocky defile which led down the descent, he looked back. On a turret, partly concealed by the battlements, a slight form, robed in black, was standing. He took off his cap. Vivian waved a mantle. Then the rocks shut him out from her sight. The party with whom he traveled consisted of the prior, who was a dark, handsome, and very austere man who seldom spoke, 6 ecclesiastics in waiting upon him, and as many lay brothers. There were 2 led sumpter horses. The road, which was rough and rocky, soon left the lake and struck off across the mountains. They passed within a mile of St. Helens, a gloomy pile of irregular buildings surrounded by a high wall. The prior said not a word all the morning, and Percy was too much occupied by his own reflections to regret the priest's taciturnity. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they reached a little mountain meadow, on a stream which fell from the rocks above in a picturesque cascade, the water of which was clear as crystal. "Here we will tarry a space," remarked the prior, "where man and horse may eat, that they live. Will it please you and yours to break bread with us?" "I thank you, reverend sir," replied Percy. but you'll allow us to contribute of our modest stores, for I am well aware that travellers carry nothing superfluous." "An it please you," replied the priest, smiling slightly, "but we travel not too lightly furnished. Travellers must needs keep strength in their bones." And indeed, from the variety and quantity of the rations spread before them as they reclined upon the turf, it seemed that the good prior did not propose to hunger nor thirst upon his journey. After he had pronounced a short and manly grace, he showed himself a stout trencherman, and the others were not far behind him, as the long ride in the mountain air was productive of keen appetites. After the meal, the prior having duly given thanks, Percy produced cigars, and offered one to the clergyman, explaining the nature of the luxury. The clergyman courteously declined it, but burst into a hearty laugh, the only one in which he indulged during the journey. "I cry you pardon," he said, "but I've heard of the terror of those things which beset our beloved cardinal when he first beheld them on board your ship. I marvel not at it, for surely the things be strange enow to us. Nathless, the smoke smacketh verily of incense," he added, as the wreaths curled around in the air. "But 'tis meet our beasts be saddled. We have yet long miles to go ere we reach the village of Harding, where 'twere well we pass the night." They accordingly set out again, and the prior became as taciturn as before. Late in the evening they were descending the further slope of the pass, and 2 hours afterwards reached, after issuing from a wood, the site of a village or small town. But as they entered it they came upon sights which struck a chill to their marrow. Burned cottages, dead cattle lying about, and scattered here and there the corpses of men, women, and children, in all states of mutilation. "What means this?" asked Percy, aghast, of his companion as they stopped awe-stricken. "It meaneth a raid and a massacre," cried the prior, with a blanched but stern countenance. "It is war, which, please heaven," he added, looking up and crossing himself, "I have done my poor best to turn from this land. Aha!" he exclaimed, looking down at the bodies of 2 men-at-arms. "This be some of the work of that villain Pembroke. There be 2 of his retainers. See you that cognizance? 'Tis his. There hath been fighting as well as murder here." "Thank heaven!" ejaculated Percy. "The scoundrel has ridden his last foray." "Aye, and thanks to you, young man, who had so gallant a hand in his overthrow. But let us ride on. There is the monastery of Merrow 5 miles beyond, where we may lodge without such ghastly company. This were a charnel house in which to rest." After another hour they reached the monastery, where they found kind welcome, and were entertained until morning. The monks had heard of the destruction and massacre at Harding, and were going on the following day to give the dead Christian burial. Early the next morning they started on their way again, after friendly adieu and thanks, to which Percy added something more substantial, to the hospitable monks of Merrow, and at nightfall reached the fens of the White Forest, where they came to the fortified camp of the Earl of Angus. Here Percy found his friends, Bruce, Warren, Pelham, and the cavalry troop, who had been refused safe conduct and passage further by the Earl of Sussex. This earl was said to have been joined by North Devon and other lords with considerable bands, and here also he learned for certainty that General Vaughan, angered by his treatment by the king, had indeed marched out of his camp with some 1,500 men and a strong force of artillery, and was now well posted some 3 miles in rear of Sussex, with whom he had been for 2 days negotiating in regard to safe conduct for Pelham's detachment and the officers with him. Moreover, there was communication in a roundabout way between Vaughan and Angus, and at midnight there arrived a staff officer from the general with a dispatch for Warren, which ran thus: "You will inform the Earl of Angus that I get no satisfaction from Sussex as to a safe passage for your party, and have this evening intercepted a messenger from the king to his lordship, the purport of whose orders to Sussex is that he attack us in force, and extirpate every American. I am fully persuaded that we must fight, and will consequently act with Lord Angus most heartily. General Levin has just joined me with 350 infantry, Hamilton's and Morton's cavalry, and Parkman's battery. This gives us some 1,900 infantry, nearly 400 cavalry, and 18 guns. I will move out of this position at sunrise, and shell the enemy out of his camp. If Angus will move with all his force to the attack at dawn and assault furiously, I think all will go well. I have fully reconnoitred the ground, and there is plenty of opportunity for the artillery to act freely, and yet be well supported. Tell Angus that I have learned how and where Sussex has his guns in battery, and my chief of artillery engages to dismount and disable them, so that by the time of Angus's attack, there shall not be one which can be fought. See that Pelham does not attempt to charge their heavy cavalry with the sabre. 'Tis of no use. Keep aloof, and use carbine and pistol. Has Percy rejoined you? Lieutenant Maywood will remain with you. Request Lord Angus to return an immediate reply, and by several messengers, in case one or more are taken or killed. Vaughan, Major General commanding. A. C. Oldham, Captain and AAG. Captain Warren, accompanied by Percy, went instantly to the quarters of the Earl of Angus, where they found the barons assembled, debating the feasibility of an attack upon Sussex, for the mountain clans could be held no longer, and their departure would render offensive operations utterly impossible. The condition of affairs was beginning to look serious, for while Sussex, even strengthened as he was by the arrival of several barons with their following, could not attack them in their position with any prospect of success, provisions were already scarce, and in the event of the defeat of Egremond by the king, the latter's army could easily cross the mountains, now undefended, and cut off the retreat of Angus from the White Forest. The American officers were courteously welcomed to the council of war. I know not, said the Earl of Angus, smiling, but that my Lord of Sussex may have done us great service in so churlishly refusing our friends passage to their camp, for I hear tonight that the General Vaughan hath sent for and received a reinforcement, that looketh as if he thought there might e'en be war. Indeed, my lord, he has so decided, said Warren, but he was interrupted by the exultant shouts of the barons who crowded around the Americans. I have orders, my lord, from the general, with most important matters to be communicated to your lordship. And he read the dispatch. It was received with the wildest demonstrations of delight. When these had subsided, Angus said, My lords, our gallant ally hath set us our measure. Now to make ready for the dance. He then proceeded to assign the various leaders to their posts, and gave his orders for battle. And now, he said, turning to Warren, how will it please you to engage, Captain Warren? I beg pardon, my lord, replied Warren, but since Captain Percy has arrived, he is in command of our small force. I think, my lord, said Percy, that as we do not wear armor, we had best not engage at close quarters with heavy cavalry, but rather take position during the action from time to time where our fire can be most effective. And I would suggest, by your leave, that your troops should be told that if they see us withdrawing from any part of the field, before the enemy's men-at-arms, they must not believe us flying, but seeking other places where we can best fight. 'Tis well thought of, sir, replied Angus, as if struck by the consideration. You could ne'er withstand a charge of mailed knights in your garb, and but a handful of you. But after what we hear of Captain Percy's prowess at Lord Dacre's castle of Eagle's Crag, and his overcoming and slaying the brute of Pembroke, we can trust him to order his battle as it pleaseth him, I ween, and blithe shall be the outcome. Then, my lord, if you authorize me to act independently, I shall take my men out in front before the general action has begun, and show you what our skirmishing is, and how we open a battle, retiring to give place to your heavy troops as you advance, and seeking new opportunities to make the most of our fire, which will probably surprise and annoy the enemy very much. 'Tis well, replied the Earl. And now, my lords, let us pledge our noble friends in a cup of wine, and then, after an hour's rest, let every baron array his vassals. I marshal the host at dawn, after marching out upon the moor. The company then separated. The Americans went to Warren's quarters in a hut of pine boughs, and lay down for what rest they could snatch. It seemed to Percy that he had but closed his eyes when the trumpets screamed the reveille. He found the squadron already drawn up on its parade, accompanied by all the American staff officers. Dr. Bruce had his hunting rifle with him, and proposed to take part in the fight, sincerely hoping that he might not be obliged to practice his profession that day. The camp was all astir, the barons leading their vassals out to the plain, where they were to be marshalled by the Earl of Angus. The artillery was being hauled out to the moor. Suddenly a gun boomed some 3 miles away, then another, and soon a furious cannonade began. The fight was on. The American artillery was plainly engaged. Percy harangued his men, telling them of the victory at Eagle's Crag, so fully contributed to by the 3 Americans engaged, and explained what he expected of the troopers, and that they must uphold the honor of the American army on this side. He was answered by 3 thundering cheers. They then marched out by 4s to the moor, being wildly cheered by the South English as they passed. The moor sloped downward for a short distance, then came a gradual rise for about a mile, then thick woods where the enemy lay. The left was protected by a deep and wide river, the right by morasses extending into and beyond the enemy's left flank. Pelham deployed his men as skirmishers, and they moved out at a trot, swiftly approaching the wood. They could already see the American shells bursting in the air above the trees. Very soon a large number of stragglers ran out into the open, in a moment more followed by a mass of men in great disorder, with knights in flashing armor riding hither and thither, evidently trying to restore discipline. As they drew nearer, they could see that these troops were arquebusiers, archers, and pikemen. The enemy now for the first time apparently noticed the thin line of skirmishers approaching, and it was seen that they were being marshaled in battle order, which appeared to be a formation in lines of columns. Meanwhile, the American cannonade increased in intensity and sounded like an incessant roar. Percy was now within 300 yards, and he ordered Pelham to dismount and commence the fire, which was done. The officers took great pains to have it careful and deliberate, and it was plain to see that it was very effective. The arquebusiers opened fire themselves, but with no effect whatever, as their bullets nearly all fell short. A few went over, but neither man nor horse was hit. It was soon observed that they were very much shaken, even by this skirmish fire of a single company, and in about 15 minutes their fire ceased, and the arquebusiers retreated pell-mell into the wood. Those on their left, however, held their ground and began to advance. The Americans had been moving forward slowly all the while, and now were within less than 300 yards of the wood. Percy looked back and saw the whole of Angus's army approaching. Having cleared the field in his front, he ordered the troopers to mount, and rode away to the right to open fire on the body of the enemy, which had marched out of the wood and was advancing to meet Angus's right wing. All at once a column of knights and men-at-arms issued from the cover and galloped straight for the little American squadron. "Wheel into line, Pelham, and give 'em a volley," shouted Percy. They waited until the enemy were within point-blank range. "Aim low, men, aim low! Ready, aim, fire!" cried Pelham. The crash of the volley snuffed out for the instant the roar of the cannon, and the head of the column fairly melted away. The survivors were thrown into utter confusion. The thunder of hoofs behind and on his flank called Percy's attention, and a body of men-at-arms, led by a knight, whom Warren recognized as the young Lord Howard of Lee, dashed by with levelled lances and waving pennon, shouting their battle-cry. They rode against the staggering column of the enemy and bore them down by dozens, a few only escaping in wild flight toward the wood. Then Percy galloped off to the extreme right, and deployed to the front again before the now rapidly advancing right wing, which was commanded by Lord Reginald Percy. The Americans rode to within 200 yards of the arquebusiers and archers, and dismounting again, opened fire, doing great execution. But the enemy halted and fired a volley, while the archers began to shoot rapidly, and while, fortunately, not a man fell, yet 3 horses were killed and several more wounded. As the right wing was now close up, Percy rallied and mounted the squadron, those whose horses were killed jumping up behind others, and moved yet further to the right, so as to uncover Lord Percy's front. The Americans were now on the edge of the morass, and they dismounted, tied their horses to trees, and began a vigorous oblique fire at the archers, who were on the enemy's extreme left. It soon became too hot for these archers, who fled into the wood again, and the American fire ceased as the right wing came up parallel with them. It consisted of the Ben Ardlacs on the flank, and next on their left was another mountain clan. Just as the Americans ceased firing, a wild shout burst from the mountaineers, who rushed forward with trailed spears to charge the arquebusiers. They received a volley at close quarters, and quite a number fell, but they only increased their pace, and a moment later fell fiercely on the enemy, whose pikemen, mingled with the arquebusiers, received them with levelled weapons. For a few moments there was savage fighting, but the onset of the mountain men was scarce checked, and they soon were seen driving the disordered ranks of the foe toward their cover. Very soon the Bernardlacs were seen to halt, and then to form a close and thick line 4 and 5 deep, the front rank kneeling, and all who bore spears in the front ranks. The reason for this was soon perceived. A body of heavy cavalry was seen coming on swiftly, riding down their unfortunate flying infantry without mercy, and driving straight at the mountaineers. A few of the best shots among the Americans opened fire, emptying a number of saddles as they advanced, but having no effect in preventing their charge. They rushed at the Bernardlacs' line, and Percy expected to see it annihilated, but to his great surprise a large number of the horses plunged onto the spears and rolled with their riders in the dust, thus throwing their whole column into disorder. But the clansmen's battle order was also broken, and before they could have extricated themselves to form another living bulwark, the cavalry had so far recovered their array as to have ridden down the disordered mountaineers, had not Lord Reginald Percy at the head of his chivalry fiercely charged the enemy in flank, overthrowing or forcing them toward the morass where the Americans were posted. These now opened a brisk fire, which completed the enemy's discomfiture. A score of horses without riders dashed into the morass, and these were seized by the American troopers in numbers sufficient to mount those whose horses had been killed or wounded. The end of section 22. Section 23 of Centuries Apart. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tom Shoesmith. Centuries Apart by Edward T. Bouvé. Section 23. Chapter 15. Grim-Visaged War, Part 2. The whole right wing was now in rapid motion toward the enemy's fortified position in the forest, the various bodies of royal troops, horse and foot, which had met with such signal repulses in their counterattacks upon this wing, having retired within their works again. But on the left the battle was still stubbornly contested in the open ground, and it was not until Lord Percy rode over with his Northumbrian vassals to the rescue of the centre and left wing that the enemy was compelled to fall back in that part of the field. Meanwhile the mountain clans on the right were having a hard time of it in their assault on the enemy's position in the woods, and Captain Percy determined to try to get round their flank through the morass with his men dismounted. Accordingly they advanced through the marshy woods, meeting with no one, until suddenly from some high ground to their left front there came a whizzing flight of arrows, and 6 men went down. Percy had an arrow through his jacket, and Pelham, less fortunate, was severely wounded in the shoulder. "Take cover, men, and commence firing!" shouted Percy, not an instant too soon, for the air was filled with arrows, and soon a body of archers advanced among the trees, drawing their long bows to their ears and shooting rapidly. They were led and directed by a knight in armor, who, however, had very nearly reached the end of his earthly pilgrimage, for in response to a sharp summons from Warren's rifle, he leaped wildly in the air and fell heavily on the forest grass. The range was only 50 yards, and the archers dropped so fast before the American fire that they soon broke and fled, but not until they had amply avenged the death of their leader, for not only did a sergeant and 2 more brave men fall dead in the hailstorm of arrows, but the young Lieutenant Russell, a gallant boy of 19, received a shaft in his heart. The foe was pursued by the Yankees into the thicker woods and toward the sound of the combat, and now could be heard at the further side of the forest the incessant rattle of musketry, as well as the roar of the American guns. The principal action was evidently between the armies of Sussex and Vaughan. Nothing more opposed Percy and his men, and suddenly, to their surprise, they found they were on the inner side of a line of strong breastworks, which had been deserted by the defenders at this point. Pushing on, they soon came upon the flank of the enemy, which there consisted of arquebusiers and archers, with some few mailed knights and men-at-arms, who, fighting furiously with the right of the mountaineers as they pressed to the attack, did not observe the stealthy approach of the Americans. These now opened a destructive flank fire upon the enemy, who, panic-stricken, broke and fled in wild disorder, followed by the clansmen, who cut them down pitilessly. Percy now formed his men on the right of the Bernardlacs, and the line immediately advanced, for the panic had become general, and the troops of Angus soon carried the whole extent of the defences, the enemy flying in complete rout. They pushed forward steadily and in good order through the open wood. Everywhere were traces of the results of the shelling in the early morning. Bodies of men and horses lay thickly about, a number of their clumsy cannon abandoned, and everything betokened the utter confusion and destruction which was due to the artillery fire of Vaughan. At last the open ground was seen in front, but no enemy, although the sound of the battle became more and more deafening. As they reached the confines of the forest, the Earl of Angus rode to the right, and the whole line halted. "Captain Percy," said the Earl, "methinks 'twere good soldiery if thou shouldst mount thy men and ride round the right of the foe on the moor yonder, that you reach General Vaughan, and with my honoured duty to the General, say that we drive the array of Sussex before us on the rear of his troops yet fighting, and that the General's cannoneers have a care not to shoot us as we charge the Earl's rear. What sayest thou?" "Excellent, my lord," replied Percy. "I will take my men back to their horses, and be here again in a few moments." This was accomplished, and then the Earl, Lord Reginald, and Percy with his troopers rode forward out of the wood, when the scene was revealed on the plain below. The force defeated by Angus was retreating in great disorder, making for the ford at the river on the left. Sussex's troops, fighting the Americans, reached almost from the morass on the extreme right entirely round the right of Vaughan's little force, completely outflanking it, and it was clear that the Americans, vastly outnumbered, were slowly giving ground, and endeavouring to protect their right flank. They were in the form of a crescent, the points of which were covered by their artillery, which was firing canister, and the cavalry, which now and then charged forward, not coming to close quarters, however, but using their carbines and pistols. A body of South English mounted archers were galloping toward the morass, evidently intending to ride round the right of Sussex's first line and attack the American left, which was close to the morass. Percy led his little squadron down the slope at a gallop, and advancing unseen by the enemy through a growth of young trees, came suddenly upon this body of archers at point-blank range. He halted immediately and ordered a volley fired at them. Then, drawing sabres, the Americans rushed to the charge. The enemy was completely confounded at this attack. Many of them fell from their saddles, and the rest, who seemed to think their foe dropped from the skies, fled pell-mell upon the rear of their first line, quite demoralizing it. Then Percy rode at a gallop along the rear of the enemy's right, marching by file so as to allow free use of the revolver by every man. A continuous fire was kept up all through the ride, with great execution, and still more valuable moral effect. In a few minutes the Americans had passed the huddled and irresolute right flank of the enemy, thus caught between two fires, and deflecting toward the morass in order to escape the shot of their own artillery in front, soon reached the American line, where roaring cheers welcomed them. Percy halted his little troop in rear of the guns, and started to find General Vaughan, whose headquarters flag he saw on a hillock in rear of the center. The general was sitting grimly on his black horse, biting away at a cigar, and looked up at Percy as if he had never been away. "Well," said he, sharply, "I saw your maneuver in getting round their flank from the hill yonder. What news from there?" "We have beaten and driven them from the field, General. Will you order each commander on the line not to fire on Lord Angus's forces, which will at once move down to attack the enemy in rear?" "Yes. There they come now. Oldham, send to each brigadier and the batteries and say that the Earl's army is now moving down the hill to attack the enemy's rear. Let them stand firm and cease firing, and be ready with the bayonet. Percy, say to Colonel Hawks that he will move round our rear to the right and join Morton. The enemy will retreat toward the river and try to reach the ford," he muttered to himself. Then, "Here, Warren, have 2 squadrons deployed on the left before that morass to stop those rascals from getting away there." By this time the yell of Angus's army, coming at a run, for the first time admonished the enemy what was upon them. At the same time the whole American line rushed forward with a cheer. For a few minutes the hand-to-hand fighting was savage and furious, but it could not last, and the enemy's entire right wing was captured or destroyed. Their center and left fought fiercely for a time, but finally fled toward the river, followed closely and cut down mercilessly by both the American cavalry and the chivalry of Angus. The Earl pressed the pursuit most vigorously, and although the battle itself had not lasted above 3 hours, yet the chase was kept up until night by the insurgent lords. The American cavalry was recalled after reaching the river, as their battle was but a defensive one, and General Vaughan did not wish to participate in the slaughter of the royal army, which now set in. The enemy's loss was very heavy, the shelling of their position in the forest in the early morning having been terribly destructive. Among those slain by the bombardment were the Earl of Sussex himself, the Earl of North Devon, and a score of lesser barons, and about 2,000 men, knights, Men-at-arms, archers, and arquebusiers fell in the shelling. All their cannon but one were dismounted, and the cannoneers killed or put to flight. Sussex and his lieutenants were in consultation in the edge of the woods when the firing began, and were plainly visible to the American artillerists. Several guns were trained on the party, and half a dozen shells burst among them. Not one escaped. The death of Lord Sussex was doubtless the cause of the royal army having been so badly handled. He was a good soldier, and great confidence was placed in him by his king. His army seemed demoralized after his death, and fought well only on the open plain, in front of the Americans, whom they greatly outnumbered, and in fact might eventually have overwhelmed, but for their rear being attacked by Angus, after he had defeated the portion of the royal army opposed to him. The fire of the American infantry had been very destructive to their heavy cavalry, which, composed of the most distinguished barons and knights and their vassals, made it a point of honor to attack the American brigades through the hottest fire. But they were mowed down so mercilessly at short range that although they charged no less than 14 times, yet they never came within 20 rods of the infantry. They then turned their attention to the batteries on the flanks, but with no better success, the canister heaping the field with them. The fire was the more terribly destructive that they always charged in column. Notwithstanding their fearful losses, however, their whole army showed the true English bulldog pertinacity, and outnumbering the Americans as they did, the fate of the day might have been quite different had the battle lasted until night, for the ammunition of the Americans was becoming exhausted, and had it come to hand fighting, there could have been no question as to the result, with men in armor 10 to 1 against those simply in modern uniform. Vaughan's cavalry, of course, could not charge the mailed knights or their masses of spearmen, and could only do effective service with the carbine and pistol. The American loss, which was about 200 killed and wounded, came from the arquebusiers and archers, and was sustained principally when the enemy's line pressed forward to outflank the American right. Vaughan's army had been obliged to fight in single line to prevent being flanked, taking advantage of every tree, rock, or inequality of ground to lengthen their front, and if the South English had attacked also in line, even 3 or 4 deep, they would have been able to outflank and almost to surround them. But, as was learned afterward from prisoners, the order from the Earl of Richmond, who succeeded to the command after the death of Sussex, was to attack in lines of columns, thinking by sheer weight of numbers to bear down the Americans. This action was not a fair sample of a battle between a modern and a medieval army. The disparity of numbers was too great to allow of its being a good test, and the fact that the Americans had medieval allies complicated the considerations. Had they been 10,000 strong and alone in the field against the 23 or 4,000 of Sussex, the contest between past and present might have presented a more strikingly instructive picture. As soon as victory was assured, Percy, with surgeons and orderlies, hastened back into the wood to find Pelham and the men who had been struck down by the arrows of the archers, and to bring off the bodies of young Russell and the other gallant slain. They found 4 of the troopers dead, the others painfully wounded. Pelham, severely hurt, had managed to crawl to the edge of the morass for water. All were brought to the American camp, which had been established on the field of battle. The American surgeons were busy with the wounded of the army. After they had attended to them, they proceeded to give like care to those of their allies, very much to the gratification of their South English friends, and lastly they turned their humane attention to the enemies injured, very much to the wonder of the South English of both sides. A proceeding of this nature was evidently beyond the comprehension of these people. It savored of a practical Christianity to which they had not yet attained. Quite a different thing seemed but a matter of course to them. The field was covered with plunderers, who despoiled slaughtered friend or foe alike, unless the dead were guarded by friends or dependents. There were many quarrels and some fights on the field over the booty, although these were sternly quelled by orders of Angus. He was compelled, in order to keep the peace among his own followers, to hang 2 or 3 men on trees, for examples. In the plundering, the mountaineers were especially active. The clans were, from the hour of victory, under no discipline or restraint except that of their own chiefs. Indeed, that night they one and all marched away, loaded with booty, for their mountain fastnesses. Bernardlac himself sought out Percy and bade him a most hearty farewell, telling him that when he came again, and as long as he should stay in the country, the Eagle's Crag was his home, and all that it contained his own to command. "Except," added the chief, "I hope and believe that my fief is to be restored to me, as it will assuredly be, an easy victory seats his Grace upon the throne. And then I be again Lord Dacre of Tisdale, and Fernmore Castle shall be more fitting abode in which to welcome my gallant friend than the Eagle's Crag. And so the clans were gone. In every particular they in their conduct, under all circumstances, seemed to Percy as almost identical with the personnel and customs of the Scotch Highlanders of the ages prior to the time of Culloden. The Earl of Angus, and all the barons indeed, came to pay their respects and render thanks to General Vaughan late in the day. They could with difficulty realize that so small a body of men could have held the vastly superior army of Sussex at bay, being themselves without armor. Yet when they saw the terrible execution done by the American artillery and rifles, they wondered in another way. They offered Vaughan anything he could ask if he would join with them for the war. Nevertheless, when he decidedly refused to do so, they apparently fully appreciated and respected his reasons for declining. He assured them that he was fully in sympathy with them, and would certainly fight again if forced to do so, but that his orders and duty toward his own government required his setting out at the earliest moment on the voyage again. They evidently regarded him as a loyal and faithful crown vassal of his president and pressed him no more. The American officers were then invited to the South English camp to supper, and as many went over as could be spared. Courtesies and farewells were exchanged, Percy parting with a special manifestation of feeling, which was fully participated in on their side, with his friends Lord Reginald and Sir Harry Percy. These gentlemen, knowing of his relations with Lady Kate, regarded him already as a brother, and expressed themselves most warmly as to his welfare, and hoped for his early return to South England. The South English army took up its route on the ensuing morning at daybreak. The Americans remained to bury their dead, and on the following day commenced their return march for their camp, burying their wounded on litters. Nothing of note occurred on the way, and they reached their destination on the evening of the 4th day. The end of section 23.
Section 24 of Centuries Apart. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Centuries Apart by Edward T. Bouvé. Chapter 16. Wreck and Ruin. The galley staggers before the gale, the icy north wind screaming. St. Elmo's lights on the tattered sail all balefully are gleaming, till kelpies swimming beneath the wave drag down the ship to her ocean grave. Northumbrian Sea Song. The repairs on the flagship were completed, and the embarkation of the artillery and stores was immediately proceeded with. Then came the question whether the royal treasurer would carry out the bargain which had been entered into at the time of the purchase of the horses, and buy them back at a greatly reduced figure. It was soon found impossible to have any communication with the royal officers, as the gates of the city were kept closed, and the burghers manned the walls as if the town were in a state of siege. The Queen, who was acting regent in the absence of the King, haughtily refused to entertain any negotiations whatever with General Vaughan. A very serious question now arose. The ships were not half supplied with coal, and although this was one of the products of the Shire of Cornwall, none could be obtained in any way. It was brought by sea to the capital, and there were no coal vessels in the harbour. Moreover, it was learned that the Queen had issued a decree forbidding the sale of supplies of every kind to the Americans. Vaughan ascertained, however, that coal was shipped from the port of Tavistock, on the southeast coast of Cornwall, and he adopted an expedient which seemed proper under the circumstances, considering the necessities of the fleet. He determined to take on board all the horses, sail for this part of Tavistock, and there take the coal by force, paying for it in horses. The utmost expedition, therefore, was used in breaking camp and getting the troops on board. In 24 hours after the plans were formed, the ships got under way. Before they sailed, however, a retainer of the Earl of Northumberland, who had been in hiding at South London, came into camp. He brought news which might, if true, be of great moment. A rumour had arrived of the total destruction of the king's army and the death of the monarch in a great battle. It could not be authenticated, as the messenger who brought the story from the north had been immediately hanged by the Queen's order. Captain Arthur Percy, exulting in the opportunity thus afforded him, immediately laid hands on this Northumbrian, and dispatched him to the north with letters and gifts for Lady Kate Percy, rewarding him in advance most lavishly, and promising him yet further guerdon from the fair lady if he should arrive safely and expeditiously. He gave him the best horse which he could select, and urged him away the same evening. It is to be hoped that the man won his further promised reward. The ships sailed slowly down the coast. A South English merchant captain had been impressed as pilot, with promise of great pay if all went well, and of a halter in case he should betray them. The fellow proved faithful, and on the afternoon of the ensuing day he guided them into a little sheltered bay, where lay a number of the clumsy South English colliers waiting for the Queen's permission to sail for South London. Several of these vessels were peremptorily ordered to haul alongside the steamers, and a full supply of coal was taken from them. It was all the property of the Crown, as it proved, and when this impromptu coaling was finished, the royal intendant in charge of the mines was invited on board the flagship, with a threat of bombardment of the town should he refuse to come. Under the circumstances he accepted the invitation. His name was Sir John Burleigh, and he was a stout, wheezy, fussy knight, a little the worse, body, soul, and habiliments for the wear and tear of time. He was presented to the quartermaster general of the army, who was a bit of a wag. "You serve the king as manager of the mines?" inquired the American officer with affected hauteur. "I did, my lord," replied the knight nervously, "and I trust I may still. But, my lord, doubtless ye know there now be two kings, King Harry Plantagenet, son of that king killed at the bloody battle of Wye, a sennight agone, and his grace the Duke of Egremond erstwhile, whom men say hath been proclaimed at Taunton. Ay, my lord, I hope I serve under the king yet." "Under which king, Bezonian? Speak or die!" thundered the American, his small eyes twinkling. Terrified by such an awful quotation, the knight turned pale, and his teeth chattered. "Verily, verily, in good sooth I apprehend you not. But 'twere meet your worship sent to the shore to inquire concerning these matters of Lord Ainslie. He yesternight seized the castle of Tavistock, belonging to his Grace of Cornwall, for his Grace of Egremond. Surely ye were the allies of the Earl of Angus at the battle of the Fens 10 days agone, and ye know of King Henry's defeat and death after?" "Ah," remarked General Vaughan, who had sauntered within hearing, "that puts a different face upon matters. Captain Percy, you will at once go ashore with this gentleman and see Lord Ainslie, with my compliments and congratulations. Tell him of our enforced appropriation of this coal, explaining our need. The quartermaster general will go with you and make a trade of those horses in payment for the coal. Let everything be made satisfactory to Lord Ainslie. Invite him and his retinue on board." This arrangement seemed vastly satisfactory to the fat knight, who was evidently in great alarm. For the possibilities were looming up in the horizon of his perturbed spirit that the sunlight might soon shine and the breezes blow betwixt his bald head and unwieldy body, and he naturally was anxious to postpone that consummation indefinitely. The party went ashore and were received most graciously by Lord Ainslie, who nevertheless pleaded his inability to comply with the invitation to visit the general, being obliged to march at once to join his Majesty King Alfred at Wyeside, whence they were to move on the capital. Percy, who had been apprehensive as to the fate of his friends in the late battle, ascertained to his great joy that all were safe. The exchange of horses for coal was gladly acceded to, as Lord Ainslie needed the animals sorely. The beasts were thrown overboard and swam ashore, where they were secured by the Baron's people. The fleet sailed again in the afternoon, and from this time the story of the voyage is an unbroken record of disaster. The coal thus obtained turned out to be of the very poorest quality, very hard and stony, and the use of it necessitated such hard and continuous work on the part of the firemen that it became necessary to detail soldiers to help them keep the fires clear, and it was found impossible to get up anything like a full head of steam. This promised badly for the time when they should be among the ice. From the best information which had been obtainable in South England, it was thought best to run up the west coast, passing through a broad strait which separated South England from a large island which lay west of it, following the warm current, which eventually, they had been told, turned off from the coast to the northwest, and as the South English mariners averred, struck the shores of the unknown ice-bound lands lying at the extremity of the open polar sea, and was lost there. It was thought that the current probably made its way between some of these islands, as they must necessarily be, and entered the South Atlantic somewhere west of the longitude of the west coast of South America. On the second night, as they were steaming slowly northwest, about 30 miles from the land, and the shores of the island referred to some 10 miles to westward of them, the short period of darkness being perfectly clear, it was then within 2 weeks of the midnight sun, suddenly one of the terrific tempests burst upon them, such as Percy had witnessed at Eagle's Crag. It seemed to come from the mountains of the island, and was a hurricane of blinding snow and hail, which prevented all progress and spread a pall of impenetrable blackness over the sea. The roar was deafening, yet upon the flagship people thought they heard guns several times. The ship had been laid head on with all the steam which could be got up. The sea was not very high, but it was churned into such a yeast of foam that it looked as if the snow was piling up on the surface of the waves. The storm ceased in half an hour as suddenly as it had arisen. But what was the dismay to find that only 2 ships responded to the signal lights from the flagship. It was within a half hour of dawn, and the ships were put about, guns fired, and through the ensuing day the fleet cruised in all directions. But nothing was seen of the missing vessel, the Weetamo, excepting one boat that was picked up stove at noon. She had gone down with all on board, leaving only this trace. On her was the battalion of cavalry which comprised in its companies that of Percy's friend and old comrade, Captain Pelham, as well as the most of the military and some infantry. The fleet sadly resumed its course again, and in 2 days saw the last of the South English coast and the islands lying north of it. Then for several days they sailed on as fast as their miserable fuel would allow, still following the warm current, and at last, at dawn one morning, saw land ahead. It proved to be mountainous and volcanic, and as had been surmised, turned out to consist of large islands lying in a line as far as the eye could reach from east to west. One of the volcanoes was smoking, and the tops of all the mountains were white with snow and ice. The warm current passed between 2 large islands by a winding strait, varying from 3 to 10 miles in breadth and about 30 in length. On either hand the mountains lay near the coast, only narrow valleys being between the foothills and the sea, and everywhere the land seemed covered with glaciers. At times the roar of icebergs breaking off was deafening, and where the strait narrowed, navigation was difficult and dangerous. detached fields of ice were floating northward, and these grew more extensive as they advanced, until, upon turning a point where the passage was only about 2 miles wide, they came upon a floe which entirely filled the centre of the strait, leaving a head on each side of but a few hundred feet in width. On the coast of the more southerly island an immense glacier came down to the sea at this point. The ice cliff was at least 200 feet high, and overhung the water in a very threatening manner. The breadth of the mouth of this huge ice river was more than a mile. The flagship entered the lead nearest the most northerly island, followed by the Sea-Mew. The other ship, the Midgard Serpent, was about 2 miles behind, and heading for the southerly channel. At this time a dense fog came up the strait in front of them, and soon enveloped everything in such murky gloom that the ship's bow was invisible from the bridge. They simply drifted along for some time, when it was thought best to anchor if possible. Soundings were got at 40 fathoms, and the Bald Eagle came to anchor, the Sea-Mew following her example just astern. They had lain there for an hour. General Vaughan, the Commodore, and 2 or 3 of the staff had walked forward to where the captain of the ship was talking with an old boatswain, who had been a whaler in Arctic seas, and was somewhat familiar with the glaciers on the coast of Alaska. As nearly as they could judge then, they were opposite the great glacier on the further shore. Suddenly a gun boomed from the other side of the strait, the deep roar being taken up by the echoes, and bandied about by the ice cliffs and precipices upon either shore, until the air seemed alive with the crashing sound. Then another and another gun followed. "Minute guns," said the captain anxiously. "The Midgard Serpent is in trouble, but it is impossible to get to her over these floes." "Good heaven, captain!" cried the old boatswain. "She must be close under that ice. The worst thing that she can do is fire guns." It was then about 11 o'clock. The fog began to clear away rapidly. In the course of 10 minutes it had risen, and the companies of the 2 ships strained their eyes peering across the floe, piled up in some places 15 feet high with the rough, broken ice. They saw the Midgard Serpent, which the floe in the further channel had crowded in almost under the terrible overhanging cliffs of the glacier, and it was apparent that she was helpless. Still they were firing guns. As they gazed, all in a moment a horrible crash of sound almost stunned them. It was followed by a grinding, rending, thundering roar, and they saw a huge mountain of ice majestically detach itself from the face of the glacier and topple over, at first slowly, but ever gathering velocity as it plunged into the sea. It seemed hundreds of feet in longitudinal extent along the glacier's face, and of the whole height of the ice sheet. As it hurled itself into the waters, a great white cloud of spray and foam flew upward, and a wave of immense proportions arose and leaped forward across the strait. It caught the unhappy ship and raised her in air as if she had been a straw, dashing her with a shivering crash on the ice floe, where she lay high and dry upon her broadside. The wave swept onward many feet above the surface of the floe, and only spent its force as it reached the open water where lay the 2 ships at anchor, its disappearing volume striking and raising them several feet. But the iceberg had fallen into the water with a rolling impetus, and as it rose to establish its buoyancy, the enormous bulk, which shot up into the air at least 100 feet in height, was seen to hang for an instant as if in the balance, and then begin to topple over again toward the floe. A spontaneous cry of horror burst from all the beholders as they saw the berg majestically, but with appalling swiftness, precipitate itself upon its helpless victim. The Midgard Serpent, and the floe upon which she lay, vanished like a flash beneath the titanic destroyer. For a while the iceberg rocked and rolled, then settled quietly upon the waves, its great translucent pinnacles gleaming with exquisite beauty in the bright sunbeams dancing about them, as in scintillating mockery of the sickened hearts of those who had helplessly watched the awful catastrophe. And there it towered, a monument of ghastly magnificence, above the icy ocean grave of 700 brave men. Every one, officer and man alike, seemed paralyzed by what they had witnessed. For hours few words were spoken, and no movements made toward getting under way. None knew how soon a similar fate might be looked for by the surviving ships. Meanwhile the ice floe moved slowly on in the current, and by the middle of the afternoon there were some miles of clear water ahead of them, except that here and there icebergs, mostly small ones, were floating along. The one which had crushed the Midgard Serpent had grounded upon a reef which made out from the southerly island, and lay about a mile away, where the channel widened again between the islands to some 5 miles. Finally they weighed anchor and began to steam slowly ahead, using the lead constantly, but keeping well in the middle of the strait. Before the short period of darkness had set in, they had the broad ocean before them, although they were dismayed to find fields of ice stretching away to the horizon on every hand. Many bergs were in sight, moving northward with the rest of the ice. The strait was some 10 miles wide, where it opened upon the sea. The shores of the lands on either side were lower and less mountainous than they had been, so that a wide expanse of ocean was visible, but no open water could be seen from the masthead, except a small space to the northeastward along the coast. The broad entrance to the strait was packed with floes and bergs, although the current had borne them on as far as this point with comparative speed. The general movement northward of the ice was plainly checked by a strong north wind which was blowing, and from the position and movements of some bergs, the old boatswain who had been so much in Arctic seas said that either the warm current turned after leaving the strait, or, what was more likely, there were counter currents which set these bergs in apparently contrary directions, although, after observing them for some hours, they appeared insensibly to be borne northward in a general drift. Meanwhile nothing could be done better than to moor the ships to the edge of the floe, which was for the time stationary. Here they lay for the night. About sunrise the wind shifted to westerly, and soon after the floe was found to be in motion, and from the masthead it was seen that a change was taking place in the condition of the ice field outside the strait. The warm current was now seen to set northwesterly, and it was to a certain extent free of ice as far as its course could be traced, although there were some bergs floating in it. It was possible that by following it they might the sooner extricate themselves from the ice, and it was decided to be best to proceed, for to remain where they were was very dangerous. Large bergs might at any hour come down on them from the glaciers bordering this channel, and if they should anchor in the clear water next the coast, a setting in of the ice or pack would crush or force them on shore. They managed to make considerable progress by noon, although still the ice bounded the horizon. The bald eagle was ahead, and had reached a large extent of fairly open water. The sea mew had passed around the other side of a berg, concealing her from view, when the sound of a signal gun broke the otherwise awful stillness. It echoed and re-echoed among the floating ice mountains about them, and the bald eagle was at once headed across the open lead so as to get sight of the sea mew beyond the berg. To their dismay she was seen careened almost on her beam ends. What had happened was but too evident. She had been caught in a nip and crushed against the low berg. Her people were getting upon the floe as rapidly as possible and unloading what they could, using the utmost dispatch of her cargo and stores. The boats were launched upon the ice. The flagship instantly steamed up to the edge of the floe and made fast to it. A petty officer from the Sea-Mew soon came hurrying as fast as the rough ice would allow. "We shall have to come aboard you, sir," he cried to the captain as soon as he was within hearing. "The bottom of the Sea-Mew is cut out of her." Even as he spoke, the nip relaxed about the fated ship, and she righted, sliding off the ice only to go down instantly. The crew and soldiers of her company managed to cross the ice, bringing the sick and also their boats and such stores as could be saved, and were taken on board the Bald Eagle, which resumed her perilous way, using every precaution to avoid a like fate. Meantime, the sufferings were great. The cold was severe, the ship was crowded to her utmost capacity. The guns and everything else which could be spared were thrown overboard to make room. All hands were put on short rations, and to crown all, a dangerous form of fever broke out. For 10 days they were among the ice before they could extricate themselves, but finally reached the open sea in longitude a little east of Cape Horn. A council of war was called, and it was determined, without a dissenting voice, to try to make the best of their way to Rio Janeiro, and thence to return to New York. They were in very miserable condition even for that voyage. The ship had been strained among the ice, was leaking badly. The fuel, poor as it was, had to be husbanded carefully, and the weather was threatening. It soon appeared indispensable to try to make the nearest port they could in South America. In case of disaster, there were not boats enough to save half the people on board. They went on, however, and, the weather being only moderately bad on the average, had reached a latitude where they might reasonably expect to come across vessels, when a terrible storm came on. Up to that time not a sail had been seen. They seemed alone on the seas. The fever was increasing, the sick dying very fast, and the distress was terrible. The storm lasted 3 days. They had the greatest difficulty in keeping the ship afloat. The leak constantly increased, and by the time blue sky appeared again, she had settled materially in the water. Everything had been done that good seamanship could suggest, but all to no purpose, and finally the masts were cut away, all spare spars got on deck, and they set to work building rafts, and getting ready stores to put on them, for it was certain that the ship could not float many hours. In fact, by sunrise of the 5th day, the sea having subsided, the rafts were launched and stores put on board, and the work of loading the sick in the boats was begun. By noon the steamer was so low in the water that she threatened to go down at any moment, and the only chance was to abandon her and take to the boats and rafts. The last men to quit the ship were General Vaughan, the Commodore, and Percy. These 3 embarked in separate boats, Percy being on board one laden with many sick men and in charge of the 4th officer of the Bald Eagle. 10 minutes after their leaving the steamer, she plunged forward, staggering under water as a mortally wounded horse falls to the earth, and these hundreds of miserables were afloat, in almost untraversed seas, in frail boats and on flimsy rafts, sick, starving, exhausted, dying, but still making a brave fight for life. Everything depended upon a quiet sea and their promptly meeting a vessel, whether a man of them all ever saw land again. As yet no sail had appeared. They tried to set their course due north, hoping to be able to reach the southern extremity of South America. But they were doomed. After a day and a half of comparatively quiet weather, a storm set in from the northeast, and the boats and rafts were soon separated. Percy and his companions found themselves at nightfall out of sight of all the others. The gale was increasing. Percy does not attempt to describe the horrors of the succeeding night. The cold severe, the boat overloaded, torrents of rain and hail, the sea constantly rising. One by one the wretches succumbed to cold and exhaustion, and were thrown overboard to lighten the boat. Toward morning there were but 7 left, and they so weak as to be unable to move. Percy remembers no more of this scene. He thought he slept. When he regained consciousness and opened his eyes, he found himself in a berth on board of a ship, with several people standing around him, one administering stimulants. They were talking unintelligibly at first, but soon he grew strong enough to understand that they were speaking Spanish. Upon looking again, he saw they were in uniform, and at length comprehended that he was on board of a Spanish man-of-war. As soon as he was able, he told them of the boats and rafts which had left the Bald Eagle, loaded to the water's edge with people, and to his great relief, the ship was instantly put about and headed for the locality about where the survivors, if any, might yet be found. They cruised for 2 days, firing guns and using every effort to find the shipwrecked unfortunates, but to no purpose. His rescuers told him that he was the only living person on board the boat when they had picked it up on the evening before. He was unable to give them any further information as to who he was, or in relation to the lost ship, for he soon became very ill, having taken the fever which had proved so fatal to the people on board the Bald Eagle. All that the Spaniards could gather from him was that an American man-of-war or transport had gone down. He was delirious until after his Spanish friends parted from him at Rio, where they put in, and where Percy was taken to the house of an American merchant, and most kindly cared for. The family with whom he found himself, when he grew well enough to be conscious of his condition and surroundings, proved to be most agreeable and hospitable people. Nothing which could be done for his comfort was omitted. He received the most tender and delicate care and the most refined sympathy. His host was a thoroughly loyal man, devoted, as far as one so distant from home could be, to the cause of the Union. As soon as Percy grew well enough to talk, he gave his friends to understand that he had been an officer on board of a transport carrying troops for an expedition which had sailed for the west coast under sealed orders, which was indeed the case, and which had met with shipwreck and the loss of every man but himself. He thought best not to communicate more, relative to the destination of the expedition, and he was well aware that a full account of the adventures of the fleet and army would have been regarded as the invention of a madman or an impostor. It was February before he was strong enough to start for home, and then he found that the most certain course was to take a mail steamer for Europe, rather than to try to reach New York direct from Rio Janeiro. Leaving his kind friends there with warmest expressions of gratitude, he sailed, and arriving on the continent in good season, crossed to England, being just in time to catch a steamer for New York. He reached home during the last days of the siege of Richmond. Having written out his report while on the voyage, he hastened, upon his arrival, to Washington, where he delivered it to the War Office. But it was evident that his report of the new discoveries of lands and nations, so accidentally made, was neither understood nor appreciated. Indeed, a high official, who had but glanced over it, said to him in a hurried interview, "Captain Percy, I am free to confess that I can scarcely comprehend, and indeed have but cast a desultory regard over your long story. I have no doubt it is of great interest, to be considered at some future time. But it is impossible, sir, to give it, or any other side issue, any attention at the present tremendous crisis. I am very sorry to find you the sole survivor of the ill-fated expedition, which would appear to have been wrecked off Cape Horn. I congratulate you on having been rescued. You must excuse me from further communication with you today, or indeed for the present. You will tomorrow receive your commission as Major in the United States Cavalry, and will be detailed at your own request to serve for the coming campaign on the staff of your friend General L. 7 days' leave of absence is granted, that you may visit your home. I wish you good night, sir. So Percy hurried on to Boston to pass a few days with his sister before reporting for duty to General L. And now, Captain Arthur Percy's diary containing henceforward only blank leaves, it becomes necessary for the chronicler of these events to appear in person upon the scene. End of section 24. Section 25 of Centuries Apart. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Centuries Apart by Edward T. Bouvé. Chapter 17. The Tragedy. Who art thou, lovely misty form, that hauntest our bivouac tonight? Thy lost love's wraith, and, warrior bold, thy young life's tale is well nigh told. Although thy heart leaps high and warm, yet shall it lie full still and cold when thee my loving arms enfold at battle's close tomorrow night. Old Song. When Arthur Percy was about departing on the fatal expedition, he begged my mother, who had been a dear friend of his own mother, to receive his orphaned sister Catherine into her home and heart. The sweet lady was only too grateful for the opportunity of extending her protection and care over the young girl, who had become at once as her own daughter. Meanwhile, in the latter part of December, I had been severely wounded in an obscure skirmish in Virginia, and after being some weeks in hospital, had been sent home on an extended sick leave. I had found this beautiful girl at home in my mother's house. She had matured since I had last seen her, which was years before, when she was but a schoolgirl. Now, if a charming young creature is thrown much into the society of a youth fresh from the field of glory, and with the scars of battle yet smarting upon him, the consequence is apt not to be other than, well, our case was a fair illustration of the natural and logical sequence. So when Captain Arthur Percy arrived at his home, he found a state of affairs existing with reference to his friend and his sister, which afforded him the liveliest satisfaction. Nothing, it seemed, could have given him more pleasure. "My dear fellow," said he to me, "it is the one thing which I should have wished for her." I found that he was going down to the army on the 3rd day after this, and I determined to accompany him, although hardly fit as yet to take the field. But the last campaign was really on, and I had been commissioned as major in the regiment during my convalescence, and could not endure being away from the front, if I could possibly sit in the saddle. I was the more anxious to go with him because his friend General L. was the brilliant leader of the cavalry division in which was our regiment, and we should be in a measure together. When I communicated my determination to him, he said, after a moment's thought, "Tom, I want you and Catherine to be married tomorrow. It is best. I want to see her your wife before I may not last the campaign out. I feel this strongly, and I should be happier if anything happened, you know." I was much startled, but of course supremely happy at the idea. Thus my own romance was accomplished. The beautiful Catherine Percy became my bride. I will not allude to the partings, with the pain and distress of the scene. Arthur Percy and I started for the front. Arthur had not given us any detailed account of the fatal expedition while at home. There was no fitting time, and perhaps he did not wish to speak of it. The horrors which attended its ending probably yet haunted him. But on our journey he told me as briefly as possible the particulars of the story, and also said that he had left his diary and papers under seal with Catherine for me to use as I saw fit in case he did not survive the campaign. I confess that I was much troubled at his story. It all seemed logical enough, and there was nothing in his manner or state of mind in itself which seemed to suggest that his brain was affected. But still the improbability of a great part of his tale was too great to allow of its being seriously considered as an actual record of occurrences. To be frank, I concluded that the sufferings and hardships of the shipwreck had unbalanced his mind. Of course, I expressed not a syllable of this, but doubtless my silence and evident anxiety impressed him. He had ended his account an hour before we reached Washington, where he was obliged to report. We were to spend the night there and start for the front in the morning. After finishing supper at the hotel, he asked me to come to our room. When we were there, he said, "Tom, I am not at all surprised that you are grieved and worried over my story, and it's perfectly reasonable that you think my mind affected. Don't start, old boy. It is quite natural that you should. I am well aware that my account seems utterly inadmissible in most particulars. But now see what I have here, and explain if you can how these things could exist unless they were authentic. Here are some letters of General Vaughan, in his own hand, written to me in South England. Here are 2 or 3 of his orders, signed by Oldham, Assistant Adjutant General of the Army there. You know the handwriting of both, and you were personally acquainted with them. Here is the very dispatch of Vaughan to Warren, received by us in the South English camp of Angus the night before the Battle of Humber Fens. Here is a Northumbrian dagger given me by the Percy himself, Earl of Northumberland. See the Percy arms, inlaid in gold in the blade. Isn't that medieval? Did you notice this sapphire ring, my betrothal ring, Tom, given me by Kate Percy? Was that stone ever cut in that strange way by European lapidary, or that ring wrought by modern goldsmith? Now here is the gold swan bracelet, or rather armlet, which poor Vivian Dacre gave me for Kate. The poor fellow choked. And now, Tom, look, here is the miniature. He drew it from over his heart. And here, Tom, is her letter to me at Eagle's Crag. Think of it, Tom. Oh, Tom, think of it. He buried his face in his hands and broke down utterly in his bereavement and misery. Talk not of grief till thou hast seen the tears of warlike men, says Mrs. Hemans. I involuntarily threw my arm around him. I looked at these things as in a dream. I was perfectly astounded, for I doubted no longer. He wanted me to read the letter. I did so. But the tremendous moment of the discoveries made by the expedition, of his experiences now that I realized them, was so intensely exciting that I sprang up and walked the room in a state of mind wrought up to the highest pitch. "Arthur," I cried, "you should never go to the front again. You should see the President and place this matter before him, together with these proofs, in such a light that an expedition would be sent at once to this Antarctic land. Why, man, 'tis a discovery more wonderful in many ways than that of Columbus. A continent found in waters not traversed for the past 400 years. English and French-speaking nations. Think what fame for yourself and glory for your country." "Ah," he replied sadly, "let us first see if we have a country. This campaign will decide that, however, and I believe with all my faith in the affirmative. No, Tom, the fighting may be short, but it will be sharp, and I must be in at the death. After that we will try to convince the government that I'm not mad, and am able to lead an expedition which shall carry Old Glory to these strange seas again. And what will it not mean for me to go there once more?" he added with vehement feeling and concentrated passion of utterance. I slept little that night, an unwise wakefulness, for we needed every moment's rest that we could get to build up for the hard work ahead. The next morning we started for the front after Percy's call at the War Office. We reached the division in good time. It was with Sheridan. You know, reader, what that meant. But I will not weary you with details of active service, which are technical and tiresome. We went through 5 forks and considerable other fighting and remained unhurt. Our losses had been heavy, however, especially in officers. Promotions were rapid in those days, and I found myself in a short time lieutenant colonel commanding the regiment. It was the night before Sailor's Creek. We had just heard of the magnificent exploit of a handful of the 4th Massachusetts Cavalry, under their heroic young colonel, at High Bridge, where they had been extirpated after such furious fighting with 2 divisions of Confederate cavalry that the retreat of the whole rebel army had been stayed for a considerable time, and we were thus enabled to cut them off as we did. We had been in the advance, pushing fiercely on, and, almost completely exhausted, were compelled at midnight to halt for a few hours' rest. I had not met Arthur for 2 days, and was very glad to see him coming to where I was sitting on a great log before my fire, after having personally attended to the placing of pickets. We were close on to the enemy, who lay in a wood beyond some open ground next the hill where our brigade had halted, which was more or less wooded. A cedar thicket stood near the spot where I was, on the extreme left, with a path running through it leading toward our vedettes on that side. "Hello, Arthur," I called. "Good to see you. Come and sit down and get warm. Tomorrow will be hot enough, though, won't it, according to all indications?" "Probably, for those who see it," he replied gravely. "I am glad to find you, Tom," he added in a tired voice. "I have something to say." Some peculiar, indescribable thing about his manner and air attracted my attention closely. Still, I did not wish to seem to watch him, although I was strangely moved by this something which was inexplicable. Sir Walter Scott speaks, in certain of his novels, of an expression used in Scotland in regard to a person who is near his death, and who shows this in some way mysterious to all but those who can read occult signs. Such a man is said to be fey. I thought of this as I looked at Percy, and with the idea already in my mind, I was not the less apprehensive after what he told me. "I have tried to see you all day, Tom," he said, "but fate has ordered otherwise. I do not know what you will think when I tell you that I have seen Kate Percy." "Oh, Arthur, Arthur," I cried, "what can this mean? You are overtired and have allowed your mind to dwell—" "Don't, Tom, please," he said very wearily. "I am very tired, but not more so than you, than we all are. I can stay with you but a few moments. The general asked me to ride over to the left at midnight and see that all was right there. 'Tis now 9 minutes of 12. I will tell you. Last night when we halted I looked for you, not knowing that you had gone forward to secure the hill in front. I was very tired, but also so singularly affected mentally that I could not think of sleep. Still I lay down, but soon rose and was walking up and down in the wood where we were, when I both felt and saw a little hand passed around my left arm. I involuntarily drew the arm closer to my side, and another hand clasped the first, and thus they were folded on my arm. I was not even startled, Tom. I looked down, and, Tom, my darling was hanging on my arm, as she did all that afternoon on the beach below the crags of Ravenscliff. The same sweet, bright, radiant smile, the same gentle voice, the exquisite violet eyes, Tom, I can't describe her beauty. It all seemed perfectly natural. And oh, how happy we were! I think we walked up and down for hours. At any rate, she had but just left me, and I had lain down again when the trumpets blew. I was not fatigued by the night spent so, but the fresher this morning. And I am happy, Tom, more happy than I can tell. I know that she is no more in this world. And the last thing she said, after all our dear talk, was, "I will come again tomorrow night, my darling, and then you will go with me, and we shall part no more." I watched Arthur all the time he was speaking. The strange look never left his face. It seemed full of a nameless peace. I could not speak, for although I felt that he had seen a vision in his sleep, yet I was perfectly sure that all was to be as he said. Still, the dreadful certainty was so oppressive that I lost all self-control. The grief of losing him seemed so appalling that I involuntarily threw both arms around him as if I would never let him go. All sorts of wild thoughts surged through my brain as I tried to think how he could be protected against the dangers of the coming day. So we sat for a while. Then Arthur, turning, kissed me simply, and with his old smile, the sweetest one I ever saw in man, said, "Good night, Tom. It is time for me to go now. Kiss my little sister for me, and tell her that I was more than happy that she is yours. You will go back safely to her, Tom. I know it." He mounted his horse and rode slowly down the path to the left into the cedars. I saw him by the firelight turn and smile once again, and then he vanished in the shadows of the wood. I sat looking into the fire, wrapped in dismal thinking. A few moments after he had gone, my orderly came to me with letters. The mail carrier had come up, with the 2nd Brigade, which had just joined us. The first I saw was from my wife, and I cut it open with impatient haste. There were 12 pages, and I was devouring it spellbound. All at once the report of a rifle on the extreme left of the line seemed to shatter the air. It was caught up, and echoed and re-echoed strangely. I could not account for the sharpness of the sound. Several shots had been fired on the line earlier in the night, but not one had begun to be so loud as this was. However, I was soon absorbed again in the letters. Suddenly I felt a strange, incomprehensible chill, and became aware that someone was sitting beside me on the left hand. I glanced up, and was surprised to see that it was Percy. And now for this, and for what follows, reader, I can no more account than can you. All I know is that it was. "Hello, Arthur," I said. "I'm right glad to see you back. I have a letter here from Catherine." I continued reading. He did not speak. At last, uneasy, I looked at his face, and was thunderstruck to see its extreme white, waxy look. His eyes were fixed in a stony gaze at the gloom over beyond the fire. "Arthur," said I, very anxiously, "what is the trouble with you?" He replied in a strange voice that sounded as if it came from far away and very slowly. "My troubles are over, my brother. Hark, there they come. They are bringing it." I heard a clanking of scabbards and a measured tramp down the forest path. "I must meet it," he said. "Good night." "Meet what?" I asked, taking his right hand. It was icy cold and stiff as that of the dead. He rose, smiling, and pointed to the wood, turning his full face to me. I shrank back, gasping with deadly horror, and caught at a limb for support. The whole left side of his face was drenched in blood, which poured from a hole near the temple. He turned away and strode noiselessly toward the path. As soon as I could gather myself, I sprang after him, calling, "Arthur! Arthur!" Then he disappeared in the gloom of the wood. I rushed after, and just at the entrance to the path came suddenly upon 4 troopers of my old squadron under a grizzled sergeant. They bore something on an improvised stretcher of poles. "Did you meet Major Percy just a moment since, Sergeant Gaunt?" I cried. "Did we meet him?" repeated the man in an odd voice. "He is here, Colonel. He was killed on the line 20 minutes ago by that shot." He lifted the overcoat cape from the face of the corpse. There he lay, the left side of the head covered with blood from a hole near the temple. The morning after the surrender of Appomattox, I started for home with Arthur Percy's body. On the evening succeeding the burial, Catherine and I were sitting together looking at the afterglow which had followed a sunset which was rare even in that region of beautiful sunsets, where the crimson and gold clouds spread a halo of glorious light over the blue hills beyond the Charles. "How Arthur would have enjoyed this!" she said. "What an eye he had for all that was fine in nature and in art! When I was a girl he taught me not only to love these things, but also to see them." She was very quiet and calm now, although she had grieved so dreadfully at first that I had feared for her life. As we sat there, I told her Arthur's story, and we took out his diaries and papers, which we afterward read in full. I delivered to my wife the things which Arthur had entrusted to me, and those which were found on his body. It had been discovered that not only had he been shot in the head, but there was also a bullet in his heart. This had gone through the corner of Kate Percy's miniature, fortunately not harming it materially. He had also on his breast, with the miniature, her letter written to him while at Eagle's Crag. It was uninjured. It was probably written on paper given her by Percy while at Ravenscliffe. It was not on the coarse, dark, thick paper used by the South English, a piece or two of which we found among Arthur's documents. The handwriting was quaint, some of the characters being of a very ancient style, but on the whole plain and fairly easy to read. It ran thus: "To mine honoured lord and betrothed husband, the noble Captain Arthur Percy, at the castle keep of the Eagle High's Crag. These by the fair hand and gentle courtesy of the most noble maid Lady Vivian Dacre. Greetings. Oh, my dear sweetheart, happily blithe be I, so may I again speak to thee, e'en in these silent words of writing. Yet bear they the loving thought in my heart unto thee. Could spoken words more? I am to say unto thee that the lovely and heart-broke Vivian Dacre be here, and strange though it seem to thee, as to me, she cometh in sorest dole to know of my lips, an I be in good sooth thine own betrothed maid and bride. And knowing now this to be indeed sooth, weeping threw she herself on her knees, praying mine pardon and grace for that she loved thee, and so had avowed to thee. And roundly I warrant me, had I answered her, but that I beheld her in so dolorous case, and ere I might speak, told she me she was the day agone at the cloisters of St. Helen's, and that she would, sans novitiate, take the veil, Yuletide past, and spend life in penance for the sin that she loved thee. And were it sin to love thee, mine Arthur? Then were I the wickedest sinner in South England. But knew she not of our vows atwixt us, poor child? Innocent enow were she, and hath my pity. She thought thee free of maiden her vows, yet finding not so, her heartstrings snapped. and she be marvellously hurt by her griefs, nor considering her mind, be there likelihood that she e'er sped happily more. Verily could I somewhat weep for her, for she were mine own dear friend, and had been utterly loyal to me in this part. Each night walk I in slumber with thee on the sands beneath the crags at Ravenscliff, and marvellous joyous be I, until hateful dawn awakeneth me to my heavy longings for thee once more. Right glad were I if I might slumber until thy return, my Arthur, witting of naught else. Yet somewhat saith to me that we be not for long sundered. Of that I am blithe. I pray the saints all days to guard thee well. Vivian hath made me to know of thy dauntless defence of the Eagle-High's Crag. I much trembled at thy peril, and yet be I lovingly proud that my captain so gallantly bore himself, and as gentle knight did his devoir. But prithee, Arthur, have great care of thy young life, which is certainly all mine own. End of Section 25. End of Centuries Apart by Edward T. Bouvé.